my proposal is that there are like three main types or classes, categories of arguments which are used by atheists to undermine theism. Let's just look at these three theses. So the first thesis is we do not require a God hypothesis for explaining the existence of the universe and its specific features. Second thesis is religious belief in God is, under some respect, under many or maybe all aspects, harmful, has negative consequences. And the third thesis is religious belief in God is false because it can be explained as a useful, as an adaptive, or maybe also maladaptive byproduct of evolution. These are three claims that are often employed in the discussion of atheists, and according to these three different arguments, I speak of the first type of atheism as justificatory atheism, the second type as consequentialist atheism, and the third type as anti-realist atheism. So the idea is, the first type of atheism says, well, there are not very good reasons that justify theism. So we do not have strong arguments supporting theism, so theism has a justificatory problem. The second type of atheism would claim just as that the effects, the consequences of theist thinking, of religion in general, are very negative, and therefore we should shy away from religious thinking. And the third thesis, or the third type of atheism would say, well, we have a natural explanation of religious thinking, so it can be reduced to some form of biological evolutionary explanation, and therefore it is at best irrational, wrong. Maybe it is useful, but it is not aimed towards something that is true. It is not aimed at something that is real, but it's just a byproduct of evolution. So therefore, anti-realist atheism. So these are the three types of atheism I'm going to discuss in my talk. Now you can distinguish between strong and weak versions of each account. So the strong account, for instance, of justificatory atheism would say there are atheist arguments that are so strong that there is no God. So the arguments can really show that God does not exist. The weaker version would say, again, for the example would be justificatory atheism. So the claim would then be atheism presents at least one argument which shows that it is very, very low, that the probability that God exists is very, very low. Or maybe sometimes the claim is also made that belief in God, belief that God exists, is unscientific. It does not fit into a scientific understanding of reality, and the best way we have to understand reality, the most truth-conducive way, so to say, for understanding reality is science. So if something is not fitting into the scientific account towards reality, then it is lacking justification. In the contemporary debate, weak versions prevail. Take, for instance, the problem of evil. The problem of evil would also be an argument which would run under the heading of justificatory atheism, right? Atheists generally present the problem of evil as one way for undermining the existence of God. So it would, the problem of evil, so to say, reduces the probability that God exists. And if you look how the problem of evil developed, then we might say that there's a certain shift from logical towards evidential accounts to the problem of evil. So in the 50s, if you think about Mackey, for instance, he was proposing a very strong version of the logical problem or the logical account towards the problem of evil. So the idea was really that we can develop an argument which disproves the existence of at least the classical God of theism, right? And then with the free will defense complementing that of others, the move was that there's no inconsistency between the claim that there exists the God of classical theism on the one hand and evil in the world on the other hand. So that it's even there are logical possibilities to combine like both state of affairs. And therefore the shift was made towards the evidential problem. And the evidential problem basically saying, if we look at the world, if we look at all the evils that are in the world, then it becomes very, very improbable that God exists. So that's a shift towards this probability problem. Now, let me just go through, so that's just a general framework of the contemporary debate. What I'm doing now is I'm going through these three types of atheism. So let's start with consequentialist atheism, and what I call the argument from harmfulness. I think consequentialist atheism is, like from a philosophical perspective, the less interesting version, but I guess it's the most popular version, just in terms of the impact it has on the general, like, public opinion. Like, if you talk to people, then very often they would claim, well, religion is bad because the overall consequences or the overall effects of religion are more harmful than beneficial. So the basic idea is, if someone is good, then religion does this person not make better, so it has not a positive effect on a good person. But if someone has a tendency towards like being bad or vicious, then religion can reinforce these bad aspects. That's the basic idea of the argument. Generally, references to historical atrocities are made, like religious wars, crusades, inquisition, so that are the general arguments presented, how, like in history, religion or religious beliefs had like very bad effects on specific groups, society as a whole, specific individuals. Now, what can we say about this type of argument? Well, a first response might be that you have always to distinguish between a pure form of religion, or what religion ideally stands for, and degenerated forms of religion, right? So you might make the claim that, like, arguing in favor of crusades is just an example of a degenerative form of religion, or at least there are also good theological arguments or there are very strong theological arguments that it is not allowed to kill innocent people. So you might make this distinction and say, well, we have to see what is the proper teaching within a religion, and how is this maybe in a bad way realized in specific historical, social, cultural circumstances. Then a second problem is, it's very hard to distinguish the main or the proper religious impact and the impact of other factors, like social factors, economic factors, cultural factors. So generally, religion is not like nice, neat parcel standing next to other factors, but it's a very complex conglomerate, right? So you have a whole mix of religious, social, economic, ethnic, nationalist factors. And they all count together. So it's very hard to say that, well, that was just religion having this bad effect. It was generally, it's just it all comes as a certain package. Like, for instance, if you look at the, like in Europe, very often the conflict in Northern Ireland is taken to be a religious conflict. But if you look deeper, then it has very much to do with certain like economic factors, social factors, a certain history, and then maybe a religion might reinforce the tensions between the Irish and the British, but it's more, it's not the, or it's hard to say that that's the main cause or the primary cause. It's more one additional structural feature, like adding additional oil to the fire, so to say. Then a third response might be, well, how do we make up a balance of all the positive and negative effects of religion? So it's very hard to make, like to calculate, so to say, the positive and the negative effects. For instance, you might say, well, if you follow certain, like purity rights, that they come with maybe they come with a lot of hardship. They are also reducing individual freedom. So you might say, well, these are negative effects. Like if you are an Orthodox Jew and you are following all these rules, then that has a very, like a deep impact on your personal freedom, on how you can just organize your ordinary life. So you might say, well, that's something negative. On the other hand, you might say, well, but the positive effect is, let's say, social cohesion, more solidarity, a stronger community life. So the question is, how do we evaluate both factors? Right? How do we say, well, the reduction of personal freedom is -10, but the social cohesion and the solidarity among Orthodox Jews, so to say, is only +8. So the overall net balance would be negative. So it's very hard to say, how can we make this balance? How can we make a proper calculation? And then maybe a last thing is, very often reflections of this, this argument from harmfulness invites to some problematic counterfactual speculations. Like sometimes people say, okay, if there wouldn't be, or if the impact of Christianity, for instance, wouldn't have been so big, then Europe would be far better off. But that's just a counterfactual speculation. We don't know at all how Europe would have developed if in the Renaissance time everyone would have become some kind of Platonist. Right? We just don't know. It's just a counterfactual speculation without any historical or sociological basis. So people just tend to speculate, but we don't know how the course of history would have gone if these factors would have been very different. Okay, so that's just a set. It's, I think, from a philosophical point of view, this consequentialist atheism is not very interesting, but also in the works of the new atheists, like if you look at Dawkins, that's the most important argument, so to say, or at least that's the most important, like, since we were talking yesterday about selling points of books, so that's for sure that's where the book can be sold to people, right? Because it's also less complex, right? If you present a very complex cosmological argument, then that's not going to be a bestseller. Okay, so let's look now at the more interesting philosophical versions of atheism. The general thrust of justificatory atheist arguments is to undermine the view that there is strong support for the belief that God exists. I'm not going to discuss now one possible reply which tries to undermine the argument right from the start. That would be something like a reformed epistemological account. For instance, Plantinga would say, well, belief in God is just basic. So we don't need any arguments, or we don't need any, we don't need a justificatory basis first in order to be justified to believe in God. But since belief in God is basic, no prior arguments in favor of the existence of God are needed. So I'm not going to talk about this kind of possible response. What are the most prominent arguments that are generally presented in the debate? I would say that's the cosmological argument, the design argument, and the problem of evil. I will focus on the first two types of argument, on the cosmological and the design argument. And a very prominent argument or thought experiment in the modern atheist debate is the Boeing 747 example by Richard Dawkins. So, what is the idea? Dawkins is saying, well, the original argument from natural theology, like the watchmaker argument, is that you look at a very complex, like you look at the complex structures of reality, you look at all the order in reality, and then you infer that this order, it's very improbable that this order is just the product of blind natural forces, that's just a coincidence that the universe is stable, that it is ordered in such a way that it even allows to develop complex life as human life. So Dawkins is saying, well, that's that's the original argument. Like if you look at William Paley, then he would just say, well, if you look at the order of things, then you're justified to draw the inference that this order, that it's extremely improbable that this order has just come about by coincidence. So the more likely explanation for this order in the world is that there has been a creator making this order. There has been a watchmaker, so to say, who put this wonderful design of the world into existence. And Dawkins is saying now, well, if this is true, like if we assume that this creation story, as it is originally or traditionally presented in religions, is true, then it seems to be that the creator has to be at least as complex as the created order itself. That's a presumption Dawkins is making. So he seems to think only a complex thing can create another complex thing. So God has to be more complex in order for being able to create another entity that is as complex or less complex as the creator himself. And then Dawkins is saying, well, but it's extremely improbable that such a complex creator exists. It's already very, like if you look at the world, and then it's already very improbable, or it's already, the probability that this world developed by natural forces, that's very low. So he's agreeing with this argument, but he says, but this does not infer that there must be a form of intelligent creator. Rather, he would say, this makes the whole story even more improbable. Like it's, because then we would have to add to the story the idea that there's an even more complex creator that is creating the world. And this makes the whole story even more unbelievable. So Dawkins is saying, basically, the idea is the existence of such a creator God is at least as improbable as a Boeing 747 coming into existence by the operations of blind natural forces at an aircraft cemetery. So the idea is you have all these things lying around, and then just the wind is somehow pulling these separated particles of old airplanes together in such a way that a Boeing 747 comes into existence. And Dawkins is saying maybe the creation of the universe, or maybe the existence of the universe, is extremely improbable, but if you add to this improbable story even more improbability, like that there exists this more complex creator God, then this does not make the whole story more probable, but it adds to the improbability. So that's the idea of Dawkins, that God is not somehow helping to solve this problem, but makes it overall, makes the whole story even more improbable. Now, what should we say about this argument? Of course, in the background, there are a few or additional assumptions, like the assumption that if you believe in this complex creator God, then you have to assume a second, like ontological realm, you have the natural realm, you have in addition this divine realm, so this makes the whole story even more complex. So Dawkins says, overall, you have to add entities, then you have some forms of, well, traditional interaction problems, which you know from mind-body dualism and so on. So he says this whole idea of God does not help to make the explanation of the existence of the universe more probable, but it just adds to the improbability of this overall state of affairs. Now, what can we say about this argument? Well, the first point would be, if you look at the tradition, then it's not evident that a complex creation needs a complex creator. Like the traditional theological claim was always that God is simple and not complex. So at least it's not evident that a complex creation points towards a complex creator. So at least there doesn't seem to be any logical inconsistency to presume that like a simple thing is able to create a complex thing. But I'm not going into this debate here. So I'm more focusing on other arguments. Like you might say, well, of course, this whole concept of creation ex nihilo sounds very strange, but there are several authors saying that we are somehow familiar with this concept. If you believe in genuine libertarian freedom, then you are a kind of creator, so to say, because every free decision is like a mini creation ex nihilo. Right, that's the idea. The idea would be, well, maybe you have prior factors that are somehow structuring your overall decision-making process. But if you're genuinely free in a libertarian sense, then this means that this free decision is not predetermined by some natural factors or some factors inside or outside you, but that's just something you are bringing about anew. So it's something like you are creating your own free decision. That's not something that can be, well, inferred from prior states within you. For instance, Kathleen Rogers, she's a scholar on Anselm, and she makes the claim that Anselm of Canterbury has kind of this theory when it comes to libertarian freedom. And Richard Swinburne is using a similar argument just to promoting this idea that creation ex nihilo is not like a unique concept or a dark concept you have to believe in, but it's something we are somehow familiar with. Then you might say, well, we are familiar with two kinds of explanation. On the one hand, we are familiar with causal explanations. We use in everyday life causal explanations. But when it comes to agency, when it comes to the realm of rationality, then we use personal explanations. When I'm asking you because you have come to this conference, then I'm not asking, unless you have been forced, right? Then I'm not asking for a causal explanation, but to a certain extent, I'm asking for a personal explanation. I want to know your reasons, what motivates you to come to this conference. And Richard Swinburne, for instance, he says, well, as long as you're on the level of causal explanations, then you can always ask, okay, what was the prior state of the universe, and what was the prior, well, like what state did cause this state of the universe? So you can go back in time till the, well, initial singularity, and then any form of causal explanation just breaks down, right? If physics is right, then this initial gravitational singularity, that's just for every, like, empirical scientific access for explaining the universe breaks down, because there is no space and time anymore in this point of initial singularity. And then you might say, well, so this causal explanation comes to a stop, but you still have the option to ask a personal explanation. You can still ask, well, but who brought this initial singularity about? Is there, or at least in principle, you can ask this question, and then you're switching from a causal to a personal explanation. Like you might, of course, you might also say, well, it's just a brute fact. We don't know. There's nothing to say about this. You can ask the question, but there's no answer to this question because any causal or scientific access is blocked. So we do not have any. There's no way to go beyond this point of initial gravitational singularity. But another option would be to continue or to ask further, but then you would have to resort to some kind of personal explanation. So Swinburne, for instance, he makes the claim that only a personal explanation brings this whole explanatory chain to a stop. Now, what might an atheist say? An atheist might say, well, that's nice, but it's just mere metaphysical speculation. Like you're now switching from the causal to the personal explanation. You're employing this whole concept of libertarian freedom, which is a very heavy metaphysical concept. So I want to stick to scientific evidence. I want to stick to what science tells me, but I don't want to enter into this metaphysical speculation. That might be one move the atheist is making. However, what is interesting is that atheists, for instance, also Dawkins, he's also resorting to metaphysical speculation, because it seems that atheists, they feel somehow uncomfortable with this idea that there's this universe, you go to this singularity point, and then every form of explanation just breaks down. But the result of this singularity event, so to say, is this ordered, stable universe. So it seems they feel quite uncomfortable, because there's always this fear that from this order of the universe you make this reference towards some personal creator. So what atheists generally, what they do is they resort to some multiverse hypothesis. So they say, well, once you have, of course, if you have not one universe, but many, an infinite number of universes, then it's not surprising anymore that all of these infinite universes is structured in such a way as our universe is. That's just that's expectable, right? If you have an infinite number of universes, then you have one that is also stable, that has all this fine-tuning in such a way that a more complex form of life is also possible. The problem with this multiverse hypothesis is that we don't have any scientific evidence. That's just a mere metaphysical speculation. So it helps you to avoid this whole question, but why, if there's only one universe, why is this universe structured as it is? Because if you have infinite many, then just one of these universes has this structure. That's something which is very likely. But again, this move, the price of this move is metaphysical speculation. because we have no scientific evidence for multiverses. Like they would be universes that are not accessible to us, if they exist at all. And as far as I can see in modern physics, like professional physicists, they are very careful to use this hypothesis. So that's not something that is part of standard modern physics. So they would say, well, we cannot say. If you want to work with a multiverse, then do so, but it's clearly not a scientific, somehow empirically informed scientific concept. So it seems that the leading assumption also of this multiverse hypothesis, which atheists use for avoiding this whole, this whole circle of questions, but why is this universe and why not another one, and why has this universe the structure as it is? In order to avoid this whole bunch of questions, the multiverse hypothesis is used, but the leading assumption for the use of this hypothesis is less scientific, but it seems to have more what I call a worldview character. So the background assumption seems to be, I do not want that God is somehow entering my explanation, so I have to find some other forms of explanation. The multiverse is a suitable form of explanation in the light of my background assumption that there is no God, that science tells us best how reality is structured. So the leading assumption in this sense is not scientific, but it is informed by like a worldview that is like a broadly sense atheist, right? If I have an atheist worldview, then a multiverse is more fitting to my purposes than, of course, than some theist explanation. But we have to be clear that the multiverse hypothesis has at least as much metaphysical speculation as this reference to a personal creator God. You might even say that the multiverse hypothesis is more complex in terms of ontology. It has a much more, it's a richer ontology than the assumption that there is just one God creating the universe. In any case, so what we have basically are three options. You can say this initial gravitational singularity is the initial point of the existence of the universe, and at the same time, that's where any scientific explanation ends, full stop. We cannot say anything about it, and we do not want to pursue any further questioning, because that leads us into these muddy metaphysical waters. Or you might say, well, we have the gravitational singularity as the initial point of the universe, but, and now the metaphysical speculation starts, but our universe is part of a much larger multiverse, so you have many other universes, and therefore it is also expected that one universe has the features as ours. Or the third option would be that the structures of the universe, especially the fine-tuning of the universe, points toward an intelligent creator. Important for me is that these are all some, you might call them comprehensive or grand theories, and they are hard to compare. But you can always say, well, maybe one option is simpler from an ontological point of view, but how you make these assessments depends very much on the worldview you have. Like from a theistic perspective, you might say that option 3 is more elegant and is simpler, because what you are assuming is just God and the universe. So you have these two entities, they are a different kind, but still you have basically these two realms of reality. Someone having an atheist or scientific-oriented worldview might say, well, I do not want to have this kind of dualism between a divine and like natural realm, so I want to avoid at any cost such a dualism. So I prefer the multiverse view, because then I have like only the natural realm, and the price is just a more complex universe. But that's fine for me, as long as I do not have this distinction between creator God, and the created universe. So what I'm trying to say is that depending on the worldview you have, you might come to different conclusions of which theory is more simple in terms of ontology, more elegant, comes with a less like burden of explanation and so on. Now a last point. If you look at the tradition of theology, then you have very often, like Brian Davis, he made this distinction quite prominent between personalist and classical concepts of God. So you might say, what atheists, when they refer to the creator or the creator God, then they refer to personalist concepts of God, however in quite a degenerative or crude form. Like the standard argument is the God of the Old or the First Testament, and this is like an old, angry man with a mixed character, quite unstable, with some superpowers. So it's more like a Superman that is hard to control, that has difficulties to control himself. So what atheists, if atheists criticize this version of God, then I would say, well, they rightly do so, but that's not the God of the theological, of the like proper theological tradition, but it's a very misconceived and what sometimes theologians also call a idolatrous understanding of God. So what are the options here? You might say, well, I want to avoid such an idolatrous thinking about God at any cost, and therefore I resort to some talk about God is beyond being, God is not existent, because existence is already like a category that applies only to the created entities or to entities, to natural entities or whatever, so it does not apply to God. So this means that when we talk about God, then this talk is purely metaphorical. So God is an ontological category on its own, and our language does not apply to this category at all. Therefore, also God beyond being, God as being not existent, and so on. So this would be one option. It seems to me that this option is quite radical, because at the end you might say, well, so does this mean that any talk about God is at the end meaningless? Right? Is it? So was Karpov right that this talk is at the end just it's not right, but it's without any meaning, because if our linguistic terms do not apply anymore to this reality, then it seems that this whole process of trying to apply language to this thing, to God, is just a meaningless procedure. So option 2 would be, well, you could stick to the God of classical theism, to the God where the simplicity of God, the impassibility of God, the eternity of God is highlighted, and then you say, well, you're right, God is a category on its own. It's there's like the transcendence of God marks a deep ontological difference between the created order and God, but there's still at least some bridge or some connection between the divine and human realm, and this connection can be referred to via analogous thinking or talk. So even though at the end the dissimilarities between God and the human real are always bigger as the similarities, still there is a connection. And with our language in an analogous way, we can still make some meaningless, we can still talk in a meaningful manner about God. So you might say the divine attributes, also of moral perfection, omniscience, omnipotence, and so on, they are different not only in quantity, so God is not just a Superman because he's more powerful than we are, but it's always also a difference in quality. And this difference in quality marks that we can only talk about God in a proper way if we talk about God in an analogous sense. Of course, one can always raise the further question, well, what does this mean now? Exactly. What does it mean that the dissimilarity is always greater than the similarity? And I think we do not have a clear, that there is no clear theory about the application of analogous terms to God. But I think the main point of this doctrine of analogy is just to say that the relationship, or that this common ground between the divine and the human or the natural real is maintained. It's not breaking down, and then all what we have is just some metaphorical talk which is always misconceived. Let me now come to the final version of atheism. So there are some atheists saying, well, religious belief is a side product of our evolutionary heritage. Take, for instance, what has gained some prominence in the debate, it's the so-called agency detecting device. The basic idea is just that, well, why do we have this notion of God as this immaterial agent being around and maybe acting from time to time in the world? So the idea is, well, it makes sense from a biological point of view that you are very sensitive towards changes in your environment. Like if you're living in the jungle, then it might be crucial for your survival that you detect a change immediately. And it might even be better, well, that you see, oh, there might be an agent behind these green leaves that might be a predator that wants to kill me. And this seems to be the original biological function. And then this function is very sensitive, so it might even overreact sometimes, but it's better that it overreacts 3 times when there is no tiger behind the leaves, but the 4th time when the tiger is behind the leaf, then it's good if you run so that you survive. So there is an adaptive function of this agency detecting device, and the idea is now, well, it overreacts sometimes, it's very sensitive, and this leads to this idea that there's this immaterial agent being around, interfering somehow with your life. So the basic, like the concept of God has this, or can be traced back to this original biological function, and it's just that then at a certain point this concept, maybe also with the development of a more complex forms of consciousness, then this whole idea that there's this agent somehow being there in the world has been formed, and then this agency detecting device just thinks that it detects this agent from time to time, like in forms of miracles or forms of mystical experiences. So there's always this agency detecting device saying, well, now there was this agent interacting with me. So the problem is, there is a clear, useful biological function, and later on, or maybe nowadays, this function is not visible anymore, it is also not as important anymore, but it has still been maintained, and a byproduct of this agency detecting device is the formation of the concept of God as an immaterial agent being close to us. And what I'm going to present you now is there's a German philosopher and biologist, and he's also atheist, but he belongs to the more serious, he's a kind of serious type of atheist, and he tries to explain the importance of different features in religious practice. He tries to explain them from an evolutionary point of view, and this looks like as follows. So he says, okay, every religion has consists in a complex of different features. The first feature would be some theoretical assumptions, metaphysical beliefs that belong to the general realm of our cognitive capacity. And he says, well, there is no biological function, that's just an evolutionary byproduct. With the evolution of our cognitive apparatus, also this tendency to form metaphysical beliefs, that comes, so to say, as byproduct or a side effect with the evolution of our cognitive apparatus. You might find here some allusion to Kant, right? Also Kant is saying that our mind is structured in such a way that it tends to pose these metaphysical questions, even though we do not have the means to answer these questions properly. Then the second feature would be some form of mystical experiences, mystical practice. This belongs to the general, anthropological constant of spirituality. And what is the biological function? The biological function is to cope with contingency. So once we realize that our existence is contingent, then mystical practices, they help us to cope with our contingent existence. So that's an adaptive feature. Then you have many community rituals in religion that belongs to the anthropological constant of our social life. Human beings are social animals. What is the biological function? These community rituals, they enforce social cohesion, solidarity, so it's also an adaptive feature, right? Then you have in every religion some myth, traditions, narratives. These narratives, they support the anthropological need for constructing an identity. The main biological function is to create an in-group, out-group thinking. So those belonging to these traditions, those sharing these myths, they are in-group, they belong to our social groups, and all the others having other myths, having other traditions, they belong to some other groups. So also this is an adaptive feature. It helps to create a higher social cohesion. Then you have ceremonies, taboos. This is identified with the anthropological constant of communication. And the idea is now that ceremonies, they have a biological function because they help to solve the so-called internal free rider problem. So the idea is basically if group members, if they invest time, energy, and so on for the community, then you might always have some individuals that want to benefit from these common goods, but they don't want to invest something for the creation of these common goods. So they just want to take the advantage, so to say, of the work or the energy of others. And the idea is now that if you have ceremonies that ask from each member a certain, investment of time, a certain effort, then this helps to solve this internal free rider problem, because the goods are not for free, but you have a certain burden, or you have a certain burden which you have to overcome, and only if I'm willing to engage in these ceremonies, or only if I'm willing to observe certain taboos, then I'm also, so to say, endowed to use the benefits that have been created or brought about by the group. So this is also an adaptive feature. And then you have fear of God, that is part of the anthropological concept of our morality, and it helps to solve the so-called external free rider problem. So that's the idea is now just that also people outside a certain group, they want to benefit from the communal goods created by the group, and how can we control, how can we make sure that outsiders are not somehow benefiting from what the group has created or has produced? Well, one option would of course be that there are certain members of the group are just controlling that no outsiders are also using the goods. Another cheaper option is that you install, so to say, in every member the fear of God, because then this fear is controlling, or at least is somehow, controlling your behavior, and then the disposition of an outsider to use the goods of the group are it's much higher, like that, or fear of God somehow reduces the disposition just to use the goods, because you are afraid that then God is going to punish you. So it's like, God is like an invisible, how do you say, a vector, an invisible, a guide, it's like a guide or an invisible, in the prison, the watchman, it's like a watchman, and you're afraid that the watchman is seeing you and is punishing you, and therefore you're refraining from just using the goods of others, although you have not contributed to them. So that's just an example of how, in this case, a philosopher of biology tries to explain why or what different features of religion, like how they might contribute to, or how they might explain why religion is part of our evolutionary heritage, and in what sense religion also adds to the fitness, so to say, of an individual. So religion is seen as a stabilizing factor for social groups, and this stabilizing factor comes with a comparable low price. So that's the idea. And now what can we say about this anti-realist atheism? Well, first, also these accounts, of course, they are rather speculative. So you have a certain empirical basis, but generally only for very specific phenomena. Like there are certain studies indicating that fear of God, or religious people tend to punish in a more severe way members of their own group than outsiders. So there we have a kind of for very specific phenomena, we have a certain empirical basis how religious people behave, and then you might come up with some explanation why this is so. But that's completely different from this very broad and general explanation that is provided here, and where religion as in general is aimed to be reduced to some biological explanation. Then again, we have the difficulty to disentangle religious from other factors. Then there's a question, like all the other functions, they are seen to be biologically useful, and only the cognitive dimension, that like this metaphysical speculations, they are seen to have no biological function, or some people even say like, that's the bad thing about religion. Like these metaphysical assumptions, they have no, they are somehow maladaptive, so to say, because they are at the end, because of these metaphysical speculations, then religious wars start and so on. So again, the problem is a sharp distinction between cognitive and adaptive features of religious phenomena is not attainable. So you cannot say, well, that's the bad part of religion, we have to get rid of the cognitive dimension, but all the rest can stay, because that's just stabilizing social, our social structures and so on. So very often also like in-group, out-group thinking goes hand in hand with certain metaphysical assumptions about insiders and outsiders, for instance. There are also certain ceremonies. There are also some guiding metaphysical assumptions in the background why the ceremony has to be performed in this way and not in another way. So you cannot just separate a certain religious practice, ceremonial practice, from metaphysical assumptions about the divine or, yeah. Then you might ask, well, why is there no selective pressure to eliminate metaphysical thinking if it's just maladaptive or if it doesn't have any biological function? And then a last point, well, you don't have a clear distinction. There's a fluent, it's a fluent process between biological evolution and cultural evolution, so to say, like the passing on of religious concepts is also seen within this larger biological framework, but that's problematic because cultural evolution works in a completely different way from biological evolution. Like cultural, like if you take this, if you use this concept of a meme, then memes, like, well, you might translate with certain ideas, certain concepts that are present in a culture, that are dominating or shaping a culture, then, like, that's just one difference. Genes are not, you cannot combine genes just randomly, but only certain genes can combine with other genes. That's not the case with memes. Like, I can basically combine any concept with any other concept. I just have to come up with a complex enough story for doing so. So cultural evolution is much more flexible, so to say. Like, I can use concepts from, like, take syncretism, Western syncretism. So you take concepts from Christianity, from Buddhism, from, I don't know, some Sufi mysticism, and you all merge it together to some kind of complex understanding of the divine. So that's no problem. But you cannot do so, like if you breed animals, you know that you cannot just mix together different animals, it just doesn't work. So genes are much more rigid, so to say, in the combinatory possibilities that memes. So also this view that the biological evolution and cultural evolution, that's just the same, and religion is just, so to say, the ideas, religious ideas are just passed on in a similar way as genes are passed on in evolutionary processes. That's problematic. And then the last point, you have to distinguish between how a concept has been developed, like from an evolutionary perspective, and the validity or the truth conclusiveness of a concept. Because you can always say, well, of course I have a biological explanation how these concepts developed, or how a certain feature, like our cognitive apparatus, developed, but this does not say anything about whether this apparatus is also truth conducive or not. So these are two different questions. Okay, so let me quickly conclude. It seems to me that atheist arguments, I was just like going over these different atheist arguments, and I just wanted to show you that it seems to me that the arguments are often much weaker as it is assumed. Like, the arguments have many blind spots, they have many blanks, they have gaps. So it's not that these arguments are so strong that people... so I think it's not the strength of the argument as such that explains why atheism is so successful, or why so many people are convinced that atheism is like true. So I'm just asking the question whether the success of atheism is not due to cultural factors. It's just that in the last 200 years or so, understanding of reality without God has been the default position. And then this default position, once it is the default position, then of course it's very hard to bring God back into the picture, because then God is always some alien or foreign element that is not fitting anymore into this atheist framework. So that's just, yeah, I would just like to conclude with this question whether the success of atheism is not also due to that we are just part of a tradition nowadays, an intellectual, philosophical tradition that to a larger extent is now atheist, at least in the sense that God is not present anymore. And once you have this absence of God, then arguments against God are also like easier to swallow or easier to accept than arguments in favor of the existence of God. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. I think we'll have a discussion, even though we are now lit. I have many questions and comments. I'll be so, yeah, I'll just ask one, because I think otherwise I won't have a chance. So you described justificatory atheism as with the thesis that we don't require the existence of God for explaining the existence of the universe. And you said one example is the problem of evil, that the argument for evil is one type. I don't see that the argument for evil has this thesis that God is not a good explanation. We don't need God for explaining the universe. The cosmological argument and the design argument, I think.
No, the problem of evil is not an argument for, and it has nothing to do with the cosmological argument.
No, yeah, but you just said, like, I think the justificatory atheism, there are three arguments.
Yeah, and they would just.
And they have this one main thesis. And
the thesis would be that God does not play any role for explaining like features of the world.
And I wouldn't say that the argument from evil has this thesis. I think it's just rather that that there is moral and natural evil speaks against the existence of God. So I think you're totally right regarding the cosmological and the design argument. But I think if you want to put in the argument from evil, maybe the thesis has to be extended. Or it would be a question.
But why?
Because the argument from evil doesn't have, like, that's not the direction of the argument from evil. It has nothing to do with trying to explain the existence of the universe.
No, but it tries to explain, like, if we look at the world, at the features of the world, then you might say, well, why is there so much evil in the world? And the simple answer is, well, there is so much evil because we are just products of blind natural forces. And if there would be a God, if there would be a good God, then there wouldn't be so much evil in the world. So this feature of reality, it's not about the existence of the universe, but certain features of the universe, like all the evils in the universe, they speak against the existence of God. So like in this sense.
Okay,
it's not
it's just the features, it's not the existence. Then maybe one could say we don't require God, but like rather it's like God's really, the existence of God would be an argument again, like speaks against it. We don't require God. It's if we assume that there's a God, it makes these features worse.
Oh, you think that the existence of God would even... So you would say that no God is better?
No, just like, the proponents of the argument from evil, they don't say, oh, we don't require God. It's like, if there's a God, it makes,
because then he would be morally responsible for
exactly.
all the evils in the world.
But, and the other thing, like from the hiddenness argument, I was just thinking how you would fit it in your three categories, and like broadly it would fit into the justificatory atheism scheme. but then I thought it's, at least the hidden argument is not undermining argument, it's rather a rebutting argument, and it wouldn't be, at least as Stenmark defends, not a weak version but a strong version. And I was just wondering how you evaluate the hidden argument, if you could put it in there. Because you said you had
right.
The main arguments of atheism fall into these two categories, and I presume you don't evaluate the hidden argument as such a
I was not seeing now the hidden argument as a proper atheist argument. Because I was focusing just on I was focusing now on the atheist debate as it was presented by Dawkins, Hitchens, the new atheists, so to say. But generally speaking, I would say also the hiddenness argument falls into the category of this justificatory atheism, because at the end also the hiddenness argument seems to me if it's true, then it makes the existence of God less probable.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. Okay, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's very interesting. I was just wondering whether you should follow the atheists in setting these arguments up as non-comparative. Because what we need to remember here is that we want a conclusion that supports atheism and not agnosticism. So if you just look at the first argument, you say, belief in God has no justificatory basis, then you would need to, whereas disbelief in God has. So on all these accounts, to avoid agnosticism, it's not sufficient just to underground belief in God, you must support disbelief in God. So I think you should rather set them up as when you ask to get rid of the theist, you need to get rid of the agnostic as well.
Yeah.
And that's the way I would...
So you would need also some kind of positive argument in favor of atheism.
Yeah, because you need to avoid agnosticism, because the conclusion is supposed to support atheism. So I know they set them up like this, but that's...
So they're still weak.
But weak, I mean, they can be weak or strong towards supporting atheism, but they must support atheism and not support agnosticism. So I would change the structure of the arguments, even though they wouldn't do that. They need to fence away agnosticism as well.
So, thank you, Alberto. So my question is, Plantinga distinguished between argument against God de facto and de jure. So what would you say about the atheistic argument de jure? Under which category in your classification would it fall?
Well, I would say that, like the arguments of the new atheists, they are all arguments de facto. Right? I would say that they are generally just pointing towards certain factual states, and that they are saying one that speaks against the existence of God. I don't know. I mean, what would you have in mind now among these arguments? Would you see anyone de jure?
I would not say it's exactly the question. If we could classify this argument under your category, so we should introduce some other category about if we say we should not believe in God because it is irrational. But maybe what I would say, maybe it's also about you atheists. And you atheists could say the belief in God is in so far bad because it supports like credulity and rationality and so on. Maybe so. it's bad consequence.
Yeah.
So, but of course it's not so, it's more sophisticated
Right.
than just to say, yeah, croissants are bad, and so they kill people, or they are pedophiles and so on.
Other questions?
Yes. Well, just a minor point. When you make an answer to the atheist objection of Dawkins as regards creation out of nothing, you mentioned the fact that libertarian freedom could be an instance of creation out of nothing. Of course, I know that this view has been supported by German idealists like Hölderlin or Schelling and others. Say die einzige Schöpfung aus Menschen ist die freie, selbstbewusste.
Right.
Okay, but I'm not sure it is convincing because in this case you are only describing a psychological process which is temporal, and on the timeless account of creation, even if in the narrative there is a decision, then one day God said, well, let's create the one. So that's if creation is the relation of dependence, it's not something psychological.
Yeah.
Even if it has psychological consequences and moral consequences. So the comparison between creation out of nothing and the free libertarian decision supposes that creation out of nothing is something like with a deliberation and even because when you decide something, even if it is a hard decision, it is never from scratch. You have experience, you have habits. Your first decision, your first free libertarian decision was certainly not something from scratch. You must have learned by doing trial and error, I suppose.
Yeah, actually, I do not think that this is a very strong argument. I was just presenting it because you find it in the literature. I think that the disanalogies are much bigger than the analogies or the similarities because, as you say, also if you look at the modern debate on free will, like if you take, I don't know, Randolph Clark, for instance, then it's pretty clear that they would all say, well, are all these preconditions, and maybe even a free decision has also a certain kind of randomness, right? That you have strong reasons for two different options, and at the end, if these reasons are even, like Kane would say, right, you have this case, there's the same strength of reason speaks in favor of option A, the same strength of reason speaks in favor of option B, and also in terms of your character, it would be perfectly fine to go this way or the other way, and then you just decide to go this way, and it has a certain random feature, and this is then again shaping your character. So you're never making a free decision out of nothing, but it's always already shaped by your narrative, by your history, by some maybe even unconscious factors that have informed your personality. And then of course the second big question is the time question. Like, can we, like all causal processes are always temporal. They are happening in time. Also our free decisions are happening in time unless you are a very strong dualist saying that your soul, your immaterial soul is out of time. Whereas creation out of nothing would really mean that God is out of time, there is no time before creation, then with creation time starts to exist. So this would really be, and I think we do not have a concept of how something atemporal creates something that is temporal.
Sorry, excuse me, he was before.
We're wasting time, yeah. Well, I have one question, maybe two questions and one comment. I would begin with a comment, what you call anti-realist position. It's nothing else than a sheer reproduction of ancient Greek naturalism and Roman, because all arguments that religion is a means for adapting humankind to the environment was introduced by Lucretius, and they only reproduce it with other scientific-like words and nothing more. And it's interesting for me whether they read some books on the history of philosophy or not. Well, I have two questions. What is your opinion of the conception that God can be beyond being, which is in vogue now? My opinion is that this proposition could have sense even if it means that God is beyond being of creatures, and he can be beyond his own being. That leads to nonsense. Would you agree with it?
Yes.
Okay. And concerning your last stance, that the dominance of atheism is less due, the main reason of its predominance at the present time you define as the strong and growing stream of atheist thinking among scientists in the last 2 centuries. But the further question arises, how would you explain this strong and growing stream of atheist thinking among them? It seems to me that this verdict begs a further question. What would be your answer to this? Where the reason of this predominance of atheistic consciousness among scientists?
Well, see, if we leave out now certain historical factors like the reduced power of the church and so on, just from a philosophical point of view, I think that it's just that this tradition was building up step by step. Like you have let's just take from the last 2 centuries, you have like Hume, you have also Kant. So they are all thinkers where God maybe still plays a certain role, but it's very often God is used as a kind of like negative foil, like for instance in Hume. Also in Kant to a certain extent, like Kant is using God in a like also contemporaries of Kant already, they said that Kant was decapitating God to a certain extent, because God just becomes an instrument for justifying like ultimate justice or whatever you have. So I think it's more that once certain people started to present very powerful arguments against at least the existence of certain concepts of God, like Hume, then maybe later Kant in the more continental tradition, also the French tradition, you might have Voltaire and others, Rousseau. So they still used God, but it was not the God of the Christian tradition strictly construed anymore. And then, so just all these people, they added to this tradition of a more naturalistic thinking. So I think this is the main, it's just, this stream of thought or of arguments it was like constantly growing, so to say, from different perspectives, like if a direct criticism against certain arguments in favor of God. In Hume, you might have like the French materialists, they had only anthropological materialist understanding of the human person, and all these different things together, they just made this naturalistic understanding of reality more and more powerful.
In other words, in your opinion, is that growing stream of atheistic thought among scientists is of philosophical origin, yes? Of modernity.
Yeah, at least in this sense that the scientists, like 200 years ago, have also been philosophers.
And it has nothing to do with the science itself, yeah?
Well, it might have to do with science itself in the sense that science does not need God as an additional explanatory factor for explaining the world. But I think like proper scientists, I would say most of them are agnostics in the sense that they say, well, science does neither prove nor disprove the existence of God. It's just beyond the scope of scientific research. We do not need God for explaining certain scientific phenomena that we can explain scientifically, but whether there exists a God or God does not exist, that is not something science can add anything in an informative way. That would just be, that's a metaphysical arguments, but it's not scientific arguments as such that are leaning towards the non-existence of God.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question will be about Dawkins' argument from complexity of creator. If I catch your idea properly, you think that personal explanation of creation is better than causal explanation of creation. So, if it's so, and you also said that argument of complexity of creator is not obvious. So, as I see it, a personal explanation of creation follows from everyday experience, casual experience. We see other people as creators of some things. Don't you think it may be the response of an atheist? Don't you think that an atheist can say that complexity of creator follows from the everyday life experience with the principle of personal creator? That in everyday life we see creators which is more complex than the thing that we create. So it's something maybe entangled to principles, and you at least may say that you cannot differ from each other, which you can answer for.
So you would say that this would just add to the atheist argument if you say, well, if you look at everyday life, then we are creators of various things, and we are more complex creators than the things we create. And this helps to, so to say, to back up this argument of Dawkins that also the creator of the world has to be complex. Well, personally I think it. I'm somehow unsure how we can compare forms of complexity. Of course, we are very complex, but can we compare our biological complexity, so to say, now with the complexity of some certain mathematical programs for calculating the expansion of the universe, which are extremely complicated programs? So sometimes I have difficulties to say, well, we have to be more complex because otherwise, what concepts of complexity are in play here? So I'm somehow unsure whether a complete or very complex machine or intelligent self-learning systems, under certain respects, I think they're more complex than we are. Under certain respects, they're much faster in learning than we are. Maybe they are bad in social cognition. But if it just comes to solving intellectual problems, also when it comes to solving logical problems, I think that, basically I do think that philosophical logic, it's just, it doesn't make any sense to create a computer solving or working on these problems because we don't get any money out from it, but a computer would be much better than humans to do so. So I think what I'm trying to say is I think there's not one notion of complexity in play here, but different notions. And so we have to say, well, what kind of complexity is right now central to the discussion? I think what stays in the background of this argument from Dawkins is something like just this traditional metaphysical principle that the cause has always to be more complex, has to be more powerful than the effect. Like if you look at Thomas Aquinas, then the idea would be only if you look at an effect, then the effect has to be less powerful than the cause, because the cause is transmitting or is losing some kind of power, so to say, when bringing about the effect. And so therefore the effect can never be more powerful than the cause. And it seems that something similar is in play here, that if you have a complex entity, then the creator of the entity has to be more complex. But as I said, I'm not sure, because I think that there are different concepts of complexity that are in play here.
Thank you.
Last question, please.
Yeah, it's a question from Pavel Butahov from Novosibirsk.
Oh, okay.
He's watching us on.
Oh, so say hello to Pavel.
Yeah, he hears it. So he refers to consequentialism argument, and just wondering what would be the purported harm of theism.
What would be that?
The purported harm of theism. And there's
Oh, the harm, or like the harm of theism, like the negative consequences of theism. Well, I think that, or what many new atheists, they would say it's intolerance, because once you have, like as a theist, you would have to say that, or let's go back to the last point of this metaphysical speculation, when I was presenting this anti-realist atheism, then the idea is, well, you have all these adaptive functions of the different religious features, and the only problematic feature is metaphysical speculation, because we don't know for what it is good for. And many atheists would say, well, it's especially these metaphysical ideas in religion that create the biggest harm, because then you start to have some fights about the right doctrine, or then you become intolerant towards people having a different concept of God. So it seems that the atheists, they would say that if we can, once you get rid of this metaphysical speculations, of this metaphysical component in religion, then religion would become much more peaceful. Or you could also resort to a certain extent, like to people like John Hick, if he can say, well, you have the real, but you don't know anything about the real, so everyone has a certain access or grasp of what the real might be like. That's all what we know. Then we become humble in our approach to religion, and this would avoid that we start to fight over religious issues or some doctrinal debates and so on.
And thanks to you, to the speaker, and for the discussion.
Thank you.
25 minutes left.
We continue for a while. Have 2 hours
Yeah.
lunch, so should we be able to?
Yeah.
Fault of the chair.
I will just restrict myself to this 25 minutes and then if you have some questions, we'll just discuss it in some short and in a speedy way. So I'm going to speak about anti-theism. I was picking this topic for my presentation for a pretty long time, actually. Just wondering what I can really say about the nature of atheism, not about the arguments theists and atheists use in their discussions, but to take some superior position and see how these arguments work. And then I realized it's too demanding. Hopefully, there's appeared a collection of essays, philosophical essays, self-healing philosophy. And here I noted the argument of Andrei Sysoev from anti-theism. And it's not the kind of anti-theism we were discussing yesterday, because it's nothing to do with new atheists, with cosmology or something. It's just some psychological approach to the support of atheism. So I outlined these 3 positions. Anti-theism is not just a separate position, it's a kind of a line of atheistic reasoning. But I like the way they rise in this question. So they ask, should we want God not to exist? I think it's a really motivating question, intriguing question. Not just a statement that we have some positive arguments not to believe in God, or saying more logically, strictly, that we have arguments against God's existence. So they asking from their personal point of view, what they would be if there were God, and should I want this consequence? So it's a kind of a superficialist argument. It took me a lot of effort to not to reconstruct Sysoev's argument, because he presents it quite clearly but very extensive, and to shorten it in 2, 3, 5 presuppositions. So the most interesting step to my mind is so it's it's the second premise, that if we deny any God's attribute, that means that we deny God in a theistic sense. That could lead us to the conclusion that there is no God. And so, relating to Vladimir's paper yesterday, he just told that Indian theism is a kind of theism, so it's like classical theism, non-classical theism, but there is no idea of God's omnipotence. So in just axiological atheism, it just means that there is no God. And this, I think, very interesting move in discussion. And the fourth step is of a high importance, because so the task of anti-theists is to show that God is not perfectly good, or putting it stricter, that God is actually morally bad. This fourth step consists of 3 sub-steps, and initial move is to put a kind of disagreement on the notion of good. So we know from metaethical discussion that there is no good way of defining good. I'm sorry. What do Andrei Sysoev is, he is just saying that yes, there is no formal or material agreement what is good. So if we don't even understand the notion of good, if we can't provide a clear distinction of the good, so there is a disagreement. So it's an obvious step. And the next step is that there is no motivation to prefer one notion of good, normative notion of good, over another. And if so, he refers to our intuition, how we pick the proper sense of good. So, as I see it, it's a, so he said that the kind of moral impulse or moral relativism. So everyone is permitted to take his, in taking his position on what is good. So why he is saying that God is morally bad? So we can take a position and say that, like Clavier outlined, that there is a secular humanism way of reasoning, humanistic way of reasoning, and we may say that, okay, I take this position and say that good is something which benefits for humans, and bad is something that, so when actual evil occurs to human beings. And then the Sysoev says that from this point of view, theistic Christian God is actually bad because he permits not even actual evils in our world, but he permits eternal evils in hell. So that's why he's morally bad from this humanistic point of view. And so there is a possibility to prove the fourth premise of the argument. And so we may proceed to the conclusion that there is no God. So what actually claims theological atheism in this version of anti-theism? They would rather say that the overall value of the world will increase if there is no God. The overall value of human existence will increase if there were no God. So there is a good argument from this humanistic approach, just a point for theists that they somehow diminish human existence and human beings. And anti-theists, on the contrary, they somehow support human beings and show that their existence has meaning within the visible world. So, as I see, the core of discussion lies in the disagreement on moral beliefs. Sysoev makes his argument in such a way that everything depends on this disagreement, this kind of disagreement. But I'm not very sure that we should begin with a moral disagreement. So we may, but we are not obliged to. Why not to ask about some other ways of disagreement? I mean, just not to relate to disagreement on our aesthetic beliefs. And the second point, and this is actually my point on watching this discussion, is that anti-theism is a kind of impersonal claim. So actually they'd rather say that not this would be bad if there were no God, but it would be worse for me, or it would be if there is God, or it would be better for me if there were no God. On the contrary, theists usually tend to discuss things in an objectivist way. So, and in my short abstract, I put some example from, it's like a thought experiment, that's the Deus non esse, which we may find in scholastic philosophy, which shows us that there are objective moral values, even if there were no God. And so the whole discussion, as I see it, moves in the direction of a strike between objectivist theistic premises and statements against subjectivist or personal statements of anti-theists and atheists. It's a kind of, the second point on this slide is a kind of supportive statement that anti-theism is usually relates to subjective or personal statements. So they usually took a human person and they don't say about all humans, but relate to me or you, so make like a rhetoric argument. So they appeal to a person, concrete person. And they show that, say that God's existence, for example, places a residual burden not on just humanity, but on you. So they deprive your freedom, your privacy, and your rationality. And then they conclude to the general, as a human, God's existence deprives freedom of all humans, their rationality. So, I think that we may proceed to the questions, and there I will try to explain my ideas in more details.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Julie.
Just to
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the talk can go on now in the discussion. Questions? Yeah, Jörg.
Well, my question is, you referred to Mr. Serogin so often, why he is not with us in this room?
He just thanked me for inviting him and said that
Well,
it is not the day he
and my
presents.
short comment is that this you are talking about in reality, about what I call the main paradox of atheism, that is the real hatred for a seemingly non-existent object, non-existent. For example, in some Buddhist and Jain texts, we have many accusations of Ishvara, while they insist that he is non-existent being. And that is a very important thing. I believe we trace it in the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and some other. And that is it is called the deeply paradoxical nature of atheism, in my opinion. What will you say about that?
Actually, I think there is such a move in the discussion that atheists just arguing about something that they find not to be existing in the world. And in this respect, I find what anti-theists say is more interesting, because some of them will assert that there is God, but they may kind of rebellious move, and say that I want him and I want you not to exist. And that they then say about the human dignity and human rationality. So it's a kind of, in terms of rationality, it's a kind of Kantian stance. They say that if the ground of moral beliefs is God, then are we so really stupid, irrational, or so on, that we can't just put our own moral standards, just to come to the conclusion on ourselves that there is some objective good or something. So I will say that anti-theism is I think it's a quite recent move in this discussion, but the appeal is more interesting and more attractive for people who are tending to think in the theistic way.
What would you say, like the anti-theist says, or the world would be better off if there is no God, because God is somehow a limiting feature, like those of my personal preferences or the meaning of my life. What would you say if I'm saying, okay, that's true, I do not want God to exist, and I'm fighting against God's existence. So, like I'm rebellious against God's existence. And this, exactly this gives special meaning to my life. Like if I'm a kind of Sisyphus, so to say, fighting against God, this gives the main meaning to my life is just I fight against this God. I know that I will lose at the end of the fight, but that's exactly what gives meaning to my life. So wouldn't this mean that the anti-theist, in such a case, he has to presuppose, or the existence of God is the presupposition for making his life more meaningful, or for giving us specific meaning to his life?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about this argument also. But you know, it's a possible counter-argument against their position. But on the contrary, they may say that so not all of them think that there is God and would be want to be rebellious. There are some philosophers who will say that actually there is no God precisely because he is morally bad, or a kind of limit to my reasoning and thinking, and to exercise my rationality and to exercise my freedom in reasoning means presuppose that there is no God. So I mean that there could be different approaches to anti-theism, and I agree with you if anti-theist admits that there is God and takes this rebellious position, we may just ask him that why he is so why he is not so smart, perhaps, just doing the putting so much effort in way.
Yes, I think this is a very, very interesting topic, and it relates also to the naval position of fear of religion quite much. I think there's a couple of things here. I think you have to distinguish between at least two versions of anti-theism. The form that have the conclusion that you're after in 9 here, therefore there is no God. The other one would just say that therefore we should not believe in God. And I think those two are quite different versions. And the rebellious type that we're talking about, well, there might well be a God, but we should not believe in God because God is morally evil. And that's another conclusion of the argument that there is no God. It's just that we shouldn't, there might be a God, but we shouldn't believe in God. So I think there's two versions of it. The other one I was thinking of is 8 in mine here. Let's see where that's 4 in you. Yeah. I mean, it makes a tremendous difference whether you stick to the first part of that sentence or the second one. Now, if God is not perfectly good, you might still wish that God would exist. For instance, most people would want to have kids, even though they know that they will not be morally perfect. Now, you can ask the question, if you would know that the child you will get will be a serial killer, would you then want him or her to exist? Then people might say no. So even if you have to trim the non-perfect good, trim it down, it wouldn't follow that you wouldn't desire that God would exist anyway. So you need to get very much on the side that God is morally bad to be rational in having another desire, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, if we take this premise 4 and just consider it isolated from other premises. There are many difficulties and many ways of reasoning. But in Shokhin's argument, it's just it's a crucial step, but it's under the second premise. So if we want to understand this argument, I think we should first understand that are we really allowed to conclude that if we deny somehow divine goodness, that we should come to the conclusion that there is no God in theistic sense? So for me it's, and then step 4 is just there could be pretty much ways how we can prove that God in some respect is not perfectly good. But what's the interesting is that we really can move from, can we really accept the second and third premises?
Yeah, but then you don't need God is morally bad. You just need to say that God is not perfectly good. You don't need anything more to get that argument running through. But then you have to say, therefore there is no such God. And then 6, therefore there might be another God of a different sort, which is not perfectly good, omnipotent and omniscient. Because that would also
but it's not atheistic. So it's
well, it could.
It's argument against theistic.
Well, you have theists that are considering whether omnipotence is something you have to trigger a little bit with. Now, you could perfectly well start thinking, well, maybe you can trigger a little bit with perfect goodness too. There's nothing what do you call it? Not stable or written in stone that you couldn't. I mean, of course, you couldn't go as far as saying that God is morally bad, but just the analogy with what we wish to be the case with kids would allow it to be, say, well, maybe not perfectly good, but as good as you can be given this and that. That's how the omnipotent attribute is qualified in these discussions. And you could still then wish God to exist.
Okay, then think about the applause.
Two questions to you. You put somewhere that along the anti-theistic view, God's existence would place a burden on the conception of what is good, what is morally good or bad. So it seems to me there is a simple way to escape this feeling, is to consider that God does not arbitrarily decide what is good or not. It does not impose us certain duties. If God is the goodness himself, which is an old Neoplatonic idea to be found also in Aquinas or recently in Norman Kratzmann about the basis of morality, God does not decide what is good or not. He is the goodness in himself, and through the creation, he orders the world to be, but he does not decide what is good or not. So it would free us against this objection of the anti-theist.
So I see your point actually, and I will agree that so there is a notion of good in itself, and I personally just pretend to understand the meaning of this notion. But anti-theists would rather say that to define good in itself means to define good first. There is no agreement.
Well, it is a huge debate, of course, but many people empirically are intuitionists. Of course, we may have disagreements about the content, which are normative principles and in which way we must apply them. But many people think that some deeds are absolutely unacceptable and some other deeds are good in themselves. And even if we have no definition, if we cannot analyze the concept of goodness, we might have an access to what is good or what is not good. And some atheists who could share those intuitions, for example, never kill an innocent or something like that, although it does not admit that there is a God as a source of the existence of the universe. And in this case, he could not object against theism that God puts a burden on morality. And you say anything about Kant. I'm not sure that Kant considered that God is the basis of morality. It's just a postulate. It can be added that morality is not of God. There is some brute fact, brute and uncomfortable fact of the practical reason, but it doesn't need God. So there are maybe two descriptions with the same reference. For the theist, the reference is God, who is goodness in himself. For the anti-theist, that what was moral commitments, there is goodness, and that's all. And an agreement is possible. They share the view that goodness is something absolute. Just like G.E. Moore, he was not at all a theist, but he considered that goodness was an absolute in itself.
So do you mean that if theists and anti-theists were meeting, theists would say that the good is good in itself, the supreme good, and anti-theists would say that good is a positive attitude to human beings, that there is a possible ground for agreement between them.
If the anti-theist renounces every concept of goodness, he cannot criticize anymore the theist for imposing a burden on morality. He said, well, there is no morality.
Yeah, you're right, but he accepts the positive notion of goodness. He just said that there is a plurality of opinions about these notions, and everybody is permitted to accept his own position. And there is no substantial argument to force everybody or substantial amount of people to agree on the one notion of goodness.
But how can you then support premise 4? You need universality to
yes,
premise 4.
That's the problem, yeah.
If I may, just because you address many interesting topics, it is about wanting or wishing something to exist or not. And this happens not only on the side of the anti-theist, who better want God not to exist, but also on the side of the theist in the third basic variant that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk. And we take that from Mawson. I did not read the paper, but I have a problem with that. You say, according to this third version, a variant of theism, we should, or at last, are permitted to believe in God, even though, or maybe even because, it is contrary to reason. So I have a problem with that because, there is a Moore's paradox. If you say, it's raining, I know it's raining, so it's contrary to reason that I believe that it is not raining.
I related here to the Tertullianus. Just I believe in God because it's absurd.
Okay.
So just I found this formalization in Tim Olson's piece.
Yes.
I think it's
okay.
interesting.
From the theistic point of view, it doesn't raise a problem for you, but you say the same move with anti-theism. one doesn't want such a bad God or such a not perfectly good God to exist. And well, this is a problem of doxastic voluntarism. If I believe or I disbelieve something or someone to exist, I must be justified, or even through an intuition, that it is not my will that something is not, which is the norm of its existence. Because I can always, at every moment, ask to myself, why do I believe that it exists, or why do I believe that it doesn't exist? If it is only just because I will it not to exist or to exist, it is self-defeating, you know. It's just my dream, just my wish, my pious intention. And so I don't understand how can an anti-theistic person be convinced that the will of someone not to exist is the norm of the state of affairs. This person exists or doesn't exist.
Sorry,
yeah, I just not to answer, but just to underline again that atheists, they usually make this personal statements. I wish on God to exist. I take good to be a positive attitude to human beings. And on the contrary, theists, I usually tend to speak about those things in an objective way. And at the end, anti-theists just ask, why are you teaching me? Why I'm not allowed to consider them good as I wish? And I think that there is a tension between the theists and anti-theists just in this case. And so it's just like a generalization from one hand and go into the particulars, discussing particular things in other case. And so there's no kind of, they pretend to share the same language, but they are talking from different points and different things in terms of the volume of the terms.
Well, while looking again at the screen, I discovered that this syllogism with 5 members is the exposition of the classical atheism. I'd like to remind of John Mackey, and which has its long varied pedigree, which comes further to Sextus Empiricus, who we were talking about, and that is a normative atheism, why you call it axiological, that is a stock reasoning of any atheism.
Yeah, axiological, I just borrowed from Shokhin, and he just says that it considers not the, so the argument relates not to evil or plurality of religion or hiddenness of God, but to values, to the value of human existence. So that's why it's axiological. But I myself also find this title also good, just misleading title, actually.
Maybe I have also 2 questions. Maybe I can squeeze them into short. But I think the one, no, I just ask one. So I'm trying to figure out what Sleptsova means with the overall goodness, which would prevail in the world if there were no God. If God would exist, there would be overall goodness in the world. And you brought an example that then, for example, we wouldn't have like religiously determined the liberty of the people would be restricted, they would have more privacy. So does he think then that there would be no restrictions at all, that there would, on liberty, on the rationality, and like so in sociological terms, which would be hard things to defend?
I see.
And would there be no evil also?
Yeah. So the truth that I edited to Shokhin this this claim about human privacy, rationality. So I found it in other place.
Oh, okay.
But he tells about that he tells that if there were God, so there would be no harm, no evil, and there would be so good.
So no moral and natural evil.
Yeah, some kind,
okay.
or at least moral evil.
Okay.
But also nature.
Okay.
Because it's like making you could prevent existence of this kind of evils.
Thank you. So Peter, thank you for the talk. So I have a comment, so maybe a short comment. Could be it reasonable to distinguish two languages in talking about good. One is language of objective good, and another a language of values. So like axiology. So we do value something, like our freedom, for example, and there is something what is preclude our freedom. So under the description of objective good. So then we could maybe more understand the motivation behind this axiological atheism. So for example, if there is God, then I have to go, I have to worship to Him. But I value my privacy, for example. I value something else. And so I would prefer, for this reason, I would prefer that there is no God, because then I don't need to worship Him. So, and this maybe we could understand more this motivation for on the one hand, and on the other hand we could maybe, I don't want to say to solve the problem about goodness, but at least we can distinguish the values and objective good, because it's really a problem, if there is a God in classical sense that He is good, He cannot be not good, because He is good. It's unreasonable. And another very short comment about this thought experiment from scholastic. It's a bit hard to understand what they really meant, but I would suggest that we could also distinguish between metaphysical good, which is God Himself, and between the way how we could understand that something is good. So every person could understand that something is good and something is not good. And so, even if this person don't think that there's God, so our knowledge about existence, so our explicit knowledge about existence of good is not necessary to understand good and bad. And so this is also maybe one source of this argument for or against theism. So I understand this is good, this is bad, something is contrary to what I value, and so I go to the conclusion, so that good is morally bad, but it's not moral, objective moral badness in metaphysical sense, but something else, so in my values, which argument here. Also, theological atheist not here. So thank you.
I like the idea about distinguishing between two languages in the discussion because it just deepens our understanding of the argument. As for preferences, between good and bad, actually, Shokhin tells us that there's no rational ground why taking the material good, for example, helping people, and deny the other material good of helping, kittens, for example. So he just said that it's my heart somehow moves me to prefer one of the other. But the problem, just for me, the problem is that the other person could have another heart and prefer kittens over children.
Yeah, sure. My first worry had to do with the conclusion you're assuming that axiological atheists have. And I said that would be one, the other one would be that one shouldn't believe in God, or the third would be that one wouldn't desire God's existence. Now my worry now is in different place. And that is this too narrow when it comes to the grounds for the conclusion. And it has a little bit with what Igor was saying first here. Here it is that you think that God is morally bad, but when I was thinking about the grounds that Nagel would have for his desire that God should exist, then I think it's human autonomy that is the reason. So it's not that he thinks that God is morally bad or anything. He thinks that it's his autonomy that is threatened or is limited by God's existence, and he doesn't really want that. For that reason, he doesn't desire God's existence. So again, to take the kid example, for some reason I'm into kids these days. When you ask somebody, well, why do you not want to have kids? Then you can respond and say, well, they limit my autonomy. And for that reason, I don't want to have kids. It's not that I think the kid is morally bad or whatever, but it limits my autonomy, and that would be one reason for it. And that would be a different form of axiological atheism. So I think you both when it comes to the grounds for it and the conclusion have to be more, not too narrow.
So thanks for the session, and I'll give you the word. What's the procedure now? Lunch? We just go together.
Yeah, like yesterday.
Yeah.